Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look at text boxes. Today we're going to look at the text box. The text box on your forms can be manipulated in many different ways. And we're going to look at a few ways today to make life a little easier for you. What we have on screen is a very simple form with 3 text boxes, 3 labels, and a button. What we'll do first of all on the form is to make the whole thing a little bit bigger, to make it easier to see. This can be done very easily by using the dialog default font command. Now it has a number of parameters. We're just going to use the first 2 parameters here. The first one being the name of the font, in this case Arial, and the second being the point size of the font. If we run our application now, we'll see that not only is the font bigger, but the entire dialog has scaled up. The dialog default font command will remain in force until your application completes, so any dialog created will actually use these settings. So at the moment we have 3 standard text boxes on screen. Each text box on screen will accept either numbers or text characters. Now at present there is no limit to the number of characters that can appear in a text box. But what happens if you have a need to limit the number of characters a user can actually type into a text box, say for example to 4 characters? How would you actually achieve this? Well, let's go to the callback function, the event handler of the dialog. In the initialization section of the dialog, we're going to put some new code in. First of all, we'll do the obvious and we'll populate the text in our first text box. If we run the application now, we'll see that the first text box has indeed got 1, 2, 3, 4 populated in it. So how do we limit the amount of text a user can actually put in? Well, we can use one of these commands. We can use the control post statement to send a message to the text box on this form to limit the number of characters that are allowed. This command, using the em set limit text, takes a single parameter, and this is the number of characters you're going to limit this text box to have. So if we run this now, we'll see our text box is populated with 1, 2, 3, 4. If we attempt to press any additional characters, they will not be allowed. However, if you're just typing it from scratch, it's still not allowed. So this is an easy method for actually limiting the amount of text you can put into a text box. Now it's a fair bit of typing to put all this in, so we're going to show you a shortcut here. We're going to add a library to our application called macros.include. The macros.include has a number of useful macros within it, one of which is set text limit. So what we need to actually run this is to populate the 2 variables. The first being the handle of the text box, and the second being the number of characters. Now a macro, when your application compiles, it will replace this line of code with what exists within the macro itself. And in the macro, it's doing exactly what we did when we pasted this in. It puts a control post command in to substitute. But it saves when you're writing code for the number of characters you have to type to get this to work. So if we run our application now, we'll see what it will do exactly as it did before, and it will not allow any additional characters going in. So we can now set the number of characters on any text box to whatever limit we wish. When you create a form, you can set a number of properties, one of which is to mark a text box as read-only. So if we nip into the form designer and have a look at that, what we're going to do is we're going to change the property of our second text box to mark it as a read-only. And we can do that quite easily by taking the ES read-only flag. And if we save that now and go back to our application, we'll find that the second text box cannot be typed into. That's very useful, but what happens if you wish a text box to be read-only under certain circumstances and writable otherwise. How would we actually change a text box which had been created as read-only to make it writable? Well, we can use another control post command to send a message to that particular object to set it as read-only. This takes an additional parameter which is either going to be true or false. If it's true, you're making it read-only. If it's false, you're making it writable. So if we change this to false, although the text box is set up when the dialog is created to make it read-only, this should turn it back into writable. And there it is. It now allows characters to be keyed, so it's now a writable text box. And since we have the ability to do this, there could be some test before this line of code to determine something in the system. For example, you may only want a certain number of users to be able to edit a text box, otherwise you want it read-only. So you could, when you create the dialog, set the text box to read-only as we have done, and then depending on some condition you're reading from some other part of the system or perhaps a database, make the text box editable. We also have a macro set up for that one as well. This macro takes two parameters, the first being the handle of the object itself, and the second one being either true or false. So if we substitute this line of code in, we'll see it does exactly what the previous one did. So we now have a way of setting a text box to be read-only or editable within your code. So if you wish to change the foreground or background colour of a text box, there's already a pre-built command in PowerBasic to allow you to do this. We can use the control set color command to set the foreground and background colours of a text box, the dialog handle, the text box handle, and two additional parameters, one for the foreground colour and one for the background colour. So if we ran this now, we would see that the third text box now has white text on a red background. Such lines of code are quite useful if you wish to highlight perhaps errors on the screen. Now at the moment when we run this particular dialog, we'll see that the focus is on text box 1, and as you tab around the form, each of the fields is selected in turn. However, if you wish to force the application to set the focus to a particular text box or other object, you can use the control set focus command. This will set the focus to whatever object we're pointing at. In this case, we're pointing it at the third text box. So when the form loads, the cursor will be automatically in the third text box. It doesn't alter the order that the tabs go through, but when the application runs and the form is loaded, it will automatically set focus to this third text box. Other commands you may well find useful are to hide a control or to restore a control to visibility. You may wish a text box to be invisible to the user when a form initially loads. You can achieve this by using the control hide command, which takes two parameters, the form handle and the object handle itself, the text box. If we run this now, we will see that text box number 1 is no longer visible. Again, as before, you may want the text box only visible to a certain user, or under a certain condition, and this can be controlled in your initialize dialog routine. If at some point later you want to restore a control to visibility, the control normalize command can be used. Now here we're hiding the control, and immediately afterwards we're showing the control again. So if we run the application now, the control will be visible. Now at the moment, as we tab around the form, we'll see that each time you tab into a field, the contents of that field are automatically selected. So that as you tab to a field, you can then overtype with the information you want. This is very useful. However, when you click on a text box, it does not automatically select the characters in it, which means if you wish to overwrite, you would have to backspace and type some characters in. So is there a way when you click on a text box that you can automatically select all the text in it, so that any character then pressed will replace what's showing? In this case, we need to go to the callback function, the event handler, and put a few lines of code in. Down at the WM command section, there is already a section set up for each of our text boxes. And if we want the second text box, the middle one, to do something once the text box has gained focus, then we're going to create a new event. This is the setFocus event. So again, we're going to be using a control post command to send a message back to the text box, and what we're using this time is the em set selection option with a 0 and a -1 parameter. This will select all the text in that text box. So if we run our application now, if we put some data into each of the fields, if we tab round, it selects as normal, but if we click on text box 2, we'll see that it automatically selects all the text in the box, allowing us to then overtype it quite easily without having to backspace or delete any characters. Although in our previous command we had highlighted the ID of the text box, the program will only get to this line of code if that particular text box has been clicked on. So we can use cbctl, which is the handle of the currently referenced control, and the code would still run as before. Which saves having to put this in. So this line of text would be generic to every time one of these text boxes had got set focus. And there is of course a macro to do exactly this. So we now have a mechanism by which we can actually pre-select the text in a text box once the user clicks on it with the mouse. And as the form automatically handles this when you're using the tab control, this will save the user doing additional button presses. It's a nice feature to have. There are many more things that can be done with text boxes, but hopefully you'll find these useful in your applications. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.